So the topic of today's lecture is the end of the old order in Europe and the birth of effectively the new order. And we will be looking, obviously, after some general comments about developments in Carpathian Rus specifically. By 1915, which was the second year of World War I, the conflict had reached a kind of stalemate. The opposing armies faced each other along fronts which, despite steadily high casualties, did not really move in any significant manner. This was the infamous trench warfare that one hears about. There might be occasionally a surge, an offensive surge by one side. For instance, the Russian Tsarist army, after having been driven out in the spring of 1915, the following summer of 1916, brought them back into Galicia, but they were pushed out once again, and the front was stabilized. And nothing then really changed. The front is basically along this boundary of Galicia. 1 year later, in 1917, two events of great significance took place. 1917. In April, the United States entered the war on the side of the Allies, and it provided them with soldiers and military supplies that helped reinforce the Western Front, because we know from the beginning we had at least two fronts, actually three: a Western Front, an Eastern Front, and a Southern Front. And Carpathian Rus was engaged in the Eastern Front directly. So now, with the entrance of the United States, there is support given to the Western Front. The main combatants were Britain and France. In February of that year, and then again in October of that year, so again only in 1917, the Russian Empire experienced not one but two revolutions. The first revolution in February 1917 toppled the Tsar and brought an end to imperial rule. So the Russian Imperial Empire as an empire came to an end. The second revolution in the former Russian Empire took place in October of that year. The October Revolution, as it's known, even though in terms of our calendar it was early November. That second revolution brought to power radical revolutionaries known as the Bolsheviks. And these Bolsheviks immediately set out to transform the former Russian Empire into the world's first socialist state, which came to be called Soviet Russia. Now, these two developments, that is America's entry into the war and Russia's two revolutions, had an important political and military ramifications in general that were played out already in early 1918. In January of that year, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States announced his country's war aims in a 14-point declaration. So the United States had already entered the war, but now a formal declaration. Why is the United States in this war? And so Wilson sums it up in 14 points. One of those points in this 14-point declaration proposed the creation of a Polish state. Poland is a state ceased to exist in the late 18th century. So throughout the whole long 19th century, there was no Poland. But now, as a war aim of the United States is one to recreate a Polish state. And another one of those 14 points called for autonomy or self-rule for the various peoples of the Habsburg Empire, Austria-Hungary. And then there was another document that in which Wilson, it was part of a speech actually, he spoke of the right of all peoples for self-determination. The phrase, which will come up over and over again, self-determination of nations, or national self-determination. His point in this speech, which by the way he very much later regretted having said, was that each nationality had an inalienable right to govern itself. Wilson's views were adopted by the Allies, and that meant that among their war aims was the political transformation, not abolishment, by the way, but the political transformation of Austria-Hungary, which is key for our story because that's where Carpathian Rus is. That second development, which played itself out first in February and then after October 1917, where we now have a Bolshevik-ruled Soviet Russia, or more precisely, an attempt by the Bolsheviks to rule the former Russian Empire, and that wasn't straightforward. But as a government, at least resident in power in Moscow, they moved the capital back from St. Petersburg to Moscow, the historic capital. The Bolsheviks did make good on their promise, which was part of their electoral campaign, or trying to get support, to promise to drop out of the war. Because from the standpoint of the socialists and the Bolsheviks, this was a war of imperialist powers. And they indeed did do that and signed a peace treaty at a town called Brest-Litovsk in what is now southwestern Belarus, almost the corner between Belarus, Poland, and Ukraine, but on the Belarus side. And they signed this treaty between Soviet Russia and the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, in March 1918. Now, why was this treaty important? Well, as a result of it, both Germany and Austria-Hungary, who were signatories to the treaty, no longer had to fight along the Eastern Front. They had a problem. They had to fight on the Western Front against Britain and France, and on the Eastern Front against the Russian Empire. Now, there is no more Russian Empire, and the successors, the Bolsheviks, sign a treaty ending the Eastern Front, so to speak. By the way, already by this time, that is the spring of 1918, Russia itself was plunged into civil war between the Bolsheviks, or the Reds, which was the color of revolution, and on the other hand, the Whites, which actually was the old symbol of royalty. And who were the Whites? All elements within the former Russian Empire who refused to live in an increasingly dictatorial Soviet state. So now 1918 begins this Russian civil war in Russia, which continues for the next 2 years, minimally. Now, the Bolshevik Revolution of November 1917, the Russian Civil War starting in the spring of the following year, 1918, also had an important impact on the tens of thousands of Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war who had been captured in the first years of the war on the Eastern Front. But now the war is over on the Eastern Front, and they were released from captivity already by late 1917. And among the released soldiers were thousands of Carpatho-Rusyns who, in those first few years, late 14, 15, 16, had, and then 17, witnessed how it was possible to topple an imperial regime and to take power in their own hands. Namely, they saw what the Bolsheviks were doing. And ideas about socialism, and certainly the end of feudal-like conditions in which the property of large landowners was confiscated, which was one of the first things that was done by the Bolsheviks. All of this proved attractive to those young Carpatho-Rusyn prisoners of war, mostly of peasant origin. And certainly those of them who returned home in 1918 brought back to Carpathian Rus stories about what they've seen and convictions now about the need for social and political change that they saw was possible as a result of their experience in the former Russian Empire. Now, this March 1918 Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed between Soviet Russia and the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, also recognized the independence of several countries along the western borders of the former Russian Empire. This peace, if you will, did not come cheaply for the Bolsheviks, and they held out for a long time. Why? Because the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, demanded and recognized certain countries along the western fringes of the Russian Empire. Up to the North, Finland now became an independent country. The Baltic states and Belarus had toyed with independence, and Ukraine. So all of these countries on the western fringe of the former empire now become independent countries, including, as I said, Ukraine, placed now under the protection of Germany and Austria-Hungary. All of these factors made it possible for the leading Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, to carry on the war, of course, on the Western Front. But by the summer of 1918, even though this was favorable conditions for them, by the summer of 1918, it was becoming increasingly evident that the Allies, now with the direct participation of the United States, were going to sooner or later be victorious. And yet, despite the increasingly weakened military position of Germany and Austria, both those states remained territorially intact, which means that the Allies never were on either German territory or Austro-Hungarian territory. And as a result of that, the Habsburg government in Austria-Hungary was able to maintain its authority over the country at least until the late fall of 1918, October to be specific, which was the very last weeks of the war, because all of you should know when the war ended on the Western Front. Anybody, please. Somebody. World War I ends actually in a very specific time, Welsh.
November 11th.
And very specifically, at 11 o'clock. So in the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns stopped. And that is why one still celebrates today, what is it called in this country, in the United States now? November 11th? It's a holiday. No, it's not a holiday, but it's certainly celebrated. Well, no, originally it was Armistice Day, but now it's changed to Veterans Day, I think. Excuse me? Can't hear a word. Remembrance Day. Perfect. That's what it's called. Remembrance Day. And by the way, still, we're in a building which was built about that time. You know that tower over here? So on November 11th, there will be a ceremony underneath that tower, because underneath that tower, engraved into the walls, are the names of students who died in World War I, first and foremost, also in World War II, and subsequent wars. So there's like a bit of, actually not trivia, but important knowledge, because you as young people should, on the 11th hour of the 11th day, go stand underneath there and watch that ceremony. After all, you are students of the University of Toronto. Those are your predecessors. So, when that war ended, and just on the eve of it, already in October, national activists who wanted to transform Austria-Hungary, or some of them wanted to break away entirely from it, they, up until then, were unable to promote their respective causes within Austria-Hungary itself. Why? Because the Austrian-Hungarian government didn't go away until armistice, actually, or the last day of October. And as a result of that, all of these desires on the part of the various nationalities within the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the course of the war had to be expressed outside Austria-Hungary among political exiles who were living primarily in Allied countries, Britain, London, in Paris, in France, but most especially in the United States. And among those many immigrant groups were Carpatho-Rusyns. We discussed their tale in North America. And they followed, not only them, but all the others in Central and Eastern Europe and also in Southern Europe, followed very closely military and political developments in their homeland during World War I. And most of that information they got from the Rusyn language newspapers that were published by those fraternal societies that we spoke about last time. Actually, the first Carpatho-Rusyn immigrants to organize were the Lemkos from Galicia. That is the Lemko region north of the crests of the Carpathian Mountains that you see up there, that green north of the crests. Already in July 1917 in New York City, they met at a congress, which they called the League for the Liberation of Carpatho-Russia. The goal of this league was to unite with a democratic Russia. That is, the Russian Revolution took place, first one, second one. In July 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution didn't occur yet, so everyone thought that Russia was going to be transformed into some kind of parliamentary democracy. And so this first council calls for uniting Carpathian Rus with Russia. But more representative and eventually more decisive were organizations comprised primarily of Carpatho-Rusyn immigrants from the Hungarian Kingdom, Hungarian Rus, which on our map here is the Prešov region and Subcarpathian Rus. In July 1918, representatives of the largest fraternal societies, remember we spoke about that Greek Catholic Union and another one called the United Societies. So these were these brotherhoods, fraternal societies. So they meet in July 1918 in a suburb of Pittsburgh called Homestead. It's one of the steel mill towns in western Pennsylvania. And there they form what came to be known as the American National Council of Uhro-Rusyns. The American National Council of Uhro-Rusyns. Why Uhro-Rusyns? Uhro is referring to Uhersko, which was a Slavic name for Hungary. So it's the American National Council of Hungarian Rusyns. That is those from the former Hungarian Kingdom. And this council adopted a resolution calling for autonomy, self-rule for their people within the Hungarian Kingdom. But if borders were to change, then their people, their homeland, should be united with the other Rus brethren living north of the mountains in the old Austrian provinces of Galicia and Bukovina. Now, considering subsequent developments, it's interesting to note that this first resolution of the American National Council of Uhro-Rusyns in July 1918 made no mention whatsoever of joining with neighboring Czechs and Slovaks. We're going to see why that's important, but it's even more ironic because the exile leaders of Czechs and Slovaks happened to be meeting more or less at the same time in Pittsburgh, because the whole country of Czechoslovakia was created in Pittsburgh in May 1918 by an agreement between Czech exiles and Slovak exiles. But Carpatho-Rusyns made no mention of this. Russian American demands on behalf of their homeland were to become a little more clarified after the arrival on the scene of a man named Gregory Zhatkovych. Gregory Zhatkovych. He had immigrated with his parents when he was 4 years old, trained as a lawyer in the United States, of all places at an Ivy League law school, University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. He was also the son of the founding editor of that very important newspaper published by the Greek Catholic Union. But until this time, he had nothing to do with immigrant politics. He was just a normal American guy running a law practice in Pittsburgh. But now he's asked by this American National Council of Uhro-Rusyns to help them. And what he does is he draws up a memorandum outlining Carpatho-Rusyn political intentions. And because of his connections through fellow students, which is always important where you go to school, on who you meet. So he was at an Ivy League school, and some of his classmates in law school were working in Woodrow Wilson's administration. And not only did he draw up a memorandum, but he was able to present it in a personal meeting at the White House. Now, you can't imagine how many immigrant leaders wanted to get an audience with President Wilson. This wasn't going to happen. But Zhatkovych did. And the memorandum that he presented to President Wilson included three alternatives, that is, three possibilities of what should happen to the Carpatho-Rusyn homeland. The first and the clearly most important one demanded, quote, that our Uhro-Rusyns, these Hungarian Rusyns, be recognized as a separate people, as a distinct people, and if possible, be completely independent. So that was the first of these alternatives. The other alternatives that were put forth included unification, but on the basis of full autonomy, with some other neighboring Slavic people. Didn't mention which one. So, another thing, let's unite with a fellow Slavs, neighbors. The worst case scenario would be if the pre-war boundaries did not change, then they would have to remain within the Hungarian Kingdom, but with full political autonomy, self-rule. Presumably, President Wilson considered a Carpatho-Rusyn independent state a little bit not realistic, so to speak, and proposed instead that this Russian-American activist, lawyer, Pittsburgh lawyer Zhatkovych, consult with other Slavic political activists that were in the United States at the time. Remember, the Austro-Hungarian Empire hasn't gone away, so they're still very active in the United States in the fall of 1918. Zhatkovych, the American lawyer, acts very quickly. Within a few days, he goes to Philadelphia, where there was something called the Mid-European Union convening, organized by American industrialists, to represent, with representatives from all of the unrecognized nationalities of Central and Southern Europe, including Armenians and including Zionist Jews, by the way. And so they're meeting, of all places, in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where the United States Declaration of Independence was signed, and where the Liberty Bell is located. All these very symbolic things. And it was there that he met with the Czech leader, who was chosen to be the chairman of this Mid-European Union, a man named Tomáš Masaryk. Do it this way, Masaryk. So Czechs, like Slovaks, like Poles, etc., had their representatives, as I said, but this guy was very well respected by everybody, including the American government. He taught at the University of Chicago for some time. His wife was from a wealthy Brahmin family, as they say, from Boston. And so President Wilson said, go meet with some fellow Slavs. So he meets with this Masaryk and starts having a discussion about the possibility of including Carpatho-Rusyns within what was just declared on October 28th, a new state called Czechoslovakia. The expectation, of course, was that Carpatho-Rusyns would receive full autonomy within this new state of Czechoslovakia. And at the initiative of Zhatkovych, he convinces the American National Council of Ugro-Rusyns to convene in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It's the eastern part of the state where Joe Biden is continually speaking about, because that's where he's from, actually. And on November 12, we're all in 1918, the day after the armistice is signed, they resolved to seek unity. Carpatho-Rusyns resolved to seek unity with this new state of Czechoslovakia, making it clear, however, already that this area to the west, this Prešov region where Carpatho-Rusyns live, but the Slovaks have been claiming that area should also be part of an autonomous Carpatho-Rusyn political entity. The United States President Woodrow Wilson, that was his suggestion, to go meet with a fellow Slavic leader, and Zhatkovych did. Wilson approved what became known as the Scranton Resolution. The Scranton Resolution, and also it was approved by this Tomáš Masaryk, who, while in the United States, was elected president of this new country of Czechoslovakia. And it was this new president of the new country of Czechoslovakia, Masaryk, who suggested, after all, we're in a democratic world, let's have a referendum to be held among Rusyn Americans in order to enhance the influence of the resolutions and give them greater legitimacy. And so in December 1918, a referendum was held. 67% of Rusyn American delegates voted for unification with Czechoslovakia. Now, about the same time that Rusyn American immigrant organizations were discussing and reaching specific decisions about their homeland, Carpatho-Rusyns in Europe itself, in the homeland, began to mobilize politically. This now became possible in a situation where Habsburg rule was rapidly disintegrating. In effect, Habsburg-ruled Austria-Hungary ceased to exist as of October 31st, 1918. During the first 2 weeks of November, 3 other states came into existence. And all of them were to have, in one way or another, a direct impact on Carpathian Rus. And those 3 new states that came into existence were Ukraine, Hungary, and Poland. Ukraine, Hungary, and Poland. Ukraine in the form of a West Ukrainian National Republic based in that region called Galicia, the old Austrian province of Galicia. And independent Poland was proclaimed in Warsaw the 3rd week of November. What did that mean? That the Lemko region, where there were Carpatho-Rusyns, was now really caught in between Poland on the one hand and Ukraine, West Ukraine National Republic, both of which claimed Galicia as their own. South of the mountains, in the Hungarian Kingdom, anti-Habsburg Hungarian leaders proclaimed an independent republic. You had that tradition of the Hungarians wanting to have a republic independent. Well, now there's no more empire. They now create an independent Hungarian republic on November 16. And it was led by a count known as Mihály Károlyi. Mihály Károlyi. Unlike the previous government, this was a rather liberal government, even semi-socialist in orientation. And they called for and hoped to have cooperation with the country's many national minorities or stateless peoples that lived within the historic Hungarian kingdom. But on the other hand, however, even though they were opposed to the Habsburg-ruled Hungarian kingdom, they were not opposed to the boundaries of the Hungarian kingdom. So we have a new republic that claims that the entire historic Hungarian kingdom should be Hungary. That, of course, would include all of Carpathian Rus, it would include all of Slovakia, it would include all of Transylvania in Romania. So this now raised problems for this new government, Hungarian Republic under Károlyi. Of course, as you can see, things are changing very rapidly in the course of 1918, following the collapse of Austria-Hungary. Carpatho-Rusyns there, however, were quick to act, aware of the Wilsonian doctrine of national self-determination. Everyone knew about it in Central Europe, heard about it. This was their clarion call. And everyone believed it was the official policy of the Allies. As a result, Carpatho-Rusyn leaders in Europe convoked their own national councils in much the same way that their immigrant brethren had done a few months earlier, beginning in the summer of 1918. And also, like many other immigrants, these national councils in Europe considered basically the same political options as were considered by Carpatho-Rusyns in the United States. Namely, one, we want autonomous self-rule. Two, preferably, would be independence. And three, possible unity with an existing country. But here they named those countries. And what were the possible unity with the possible countries? Russia, Ukraine, Czechoslovakia, or if necessary, remaining within Hungary. During a 6-month period, because I'm not going to go into too detail here because these councils are very complex, but from November 8th, when the first council was established, November 8th, 1918, until May 16th, 1919. So during these 6 months, we had several national councils set up throughout Carpathian Rus, also, that is in the Lemko region, in the Prešov region, the south of the mountains in Subcarpathian Rus, and the Mara-Maros region. Local leaders struggling to find an optimal solution. By the very beginning of 1919, 4 political orientations, in a sense, crystallized. And those 4 were: 1, unification with Russia, albeit a democratic Russia. 2, unification with Czechoslovakia, this new state. 3, unification with Hungary, which is now a republic. And 4, unification with Ukraine, another new state, and very specifically the West Ukrainian National Republic. In 2 cases, when a given council's desire proved unachievable, it proclaimed even an independent state. So we have a short-lived Lemko Republic in southeastern Poland that existed from December 1918 until as late as March 1920. And certainly none of these national councils was acting in isolation. Rather, they were influenced by and trying to maneuver among the newly formed political entities that were competing to take control of this region. And of those 4 options that I just mentioned, possible unification with an existing state, the Russian option was quickly eliminated because of the civil war and foreign invasions of the former Tsarist Empire. The Ukrainian option, in the form of a West Ukrainian National Republic based in the former Austrian province of Galicia, also proved impossible because of a war that broke out immediately with Poland already on November 1st, 1918, in which both Poles and Ukrainians are fighting for control of Galicia. So that option doesn't work either. The Hungarian option seemed to have some promise. Convinced that it had the support of local Carpatho-Rusyn leaders, and it did of some, especially in the influential Greek Catholic Church, this government of the Republic, headed by Károlyi, adopted a law in December 1918 which called into existence literally an autonomous province called Ruska Krajina, the Rus land. Ruska Krajina. So they actually create an autonomous province. It has its own ministers, and they even have elections to a diet. 42 representatives, actually. And that diet met in February and in March of 1919. But in the end, neither the Ukrainian, certainly not the Russian, but neither the Ukrainian nor the Hungarian option had any real hope of surviving. On the northern slopes of the mountains, the Polish army succeeded by June 1918 in driving out the West Ukrainian National Republic. The Allied powers then authorized Poland to occupy the former province of Austrian Galicia, and that was the end of those efforts for independence for a Western Ukrainian state. As for the Hungarians, they became fully compromised in the eyes of the victorious Allies because in March 1919, Károlyi's government fell, and it was replaced, of all things, by a Bolshevik-style Soviet government headed by a man named Béla Kun. In early 1919, because this is where we are, when the victorious Allied powers, led by the United States, Great Britain, and France, convened in Paris the Paris Peace Conference. Their goal was to determine the new post-war order. One of the major concerns that they were faced with was Bolshevik Russia, because the Bolsheviks were predicting they are only the first revolution of socialist revolutions that are going to take place throughout the world. There's going to be world revolution. And these revolutions were slated to spread first to Central Europe. And we have the example already of Hungary in March 1919. And so the Allies, concerned about Bolshevik Hungary, right in the center of Europe, authorized and gave military assistance to both the armies of the new state of Czechoslovakia and the armies of Romania to enter historic Hungarian territory, the Czechoslovaks from the north and the Romanians from the east. And so by August 1919, when this Bolshevik government of Hungary in the heart of the Danubian Basin was now crushed as a result of the Czechoslovak invasion and the Romanian invasion, authorized by the Allies in Paris. As a result of that, 2/3 of the historic Hungarian kingdom was now in the hands of other states. And the Rusyn inhabited lands in former northern Hungary were now under the control of Czechoslovak armed forces. Carpatho-Rusyn political activists saw what was happening, quickly adapted to these new political realities. Those Carpatho-Rusyn leaders who had favored either the Hungarian option or the Ukrainian option now joined with their brethren in support of the Czechoslovak option, the Czechoslovak solution. And then in the midst of all of this, never to go away, Zhatkovych comes from Pittsburgh, travels to the homeland. He arrives in Uzhhorod in March 1919, and he proceeds to convince those former local Hungarian supporters or sympathizers about the advantages of joining Czechoslovakia. And the result was a gathering in Uzhhorod began on May 8th. They sat for a week from May 8th to May 16th in deliberations about what to do with their homeland. About 200 delegates were present from all of those other councils that had met between that 6-month period. And now they formed something called the Central Rusyn National Council. After that week of deliberations, the Central Rusyn National Council declared, quote, in the name of the whole nation that it completely endorses the decision of the American National Council of Uhro-Rusyns to unite with the Czechoslovak state on the basis of full national autonomy. Actually, there were losers at this council. The Lemko-Rusyns from the north, they also showed up. They also wanted to join Czechoslovakia. But this would, again, cause problems with the Poles. Czechoslovakia wasn't quite ready for this. They had enough problems with the Poles already for other matters. And Zhatkovych, being the practical American politician, said, no, we don't need this. Let's just stick with the lands in the former northeastern part of the Hungarian Kingdom. And so they were rejected. As for the Czechoslovak government, it did incorporate the basic decisions of this Uzhhorod Central Russian National Council of May 1919 as part of its own territorial proposals submitted to the Paris Peace Conference, which, by the way, was meeting at the Paris Peace Conference didn't take place in Paris. It took place in various palaces outside of Paris, the most famous being, because everyone thinks of this all the time, does anyone know what the most famous of these palaces were? The palace of Louis XIV, it was the Versailles Palace. And everyone talks about the Versailles Treaty. Well, there was a Versailles Treaty, but it was only one of 5 treaties of the Paris Peace Conference. The treaty, though, that fixed Czechoslovakia's borders was adapted at another one of those palaces called Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Saint-Germain-en-Laye in September 1919. And as a result of those decisions at that treaty, very important, it was an international agreement, and it specified very specifically, and I quote, the Ruthene territory, Ruthene is the French variant of Ruthenian or Rusyn, the Ruthene territory south of the Carpathians is to be endowed with the fullest degree of self-government compatible with the unity of the Czechoslovak state. So this is enshrined in an international treaty at the Paris Peace Conference, very specifically. And notice it's being called the Ruthene territory. Of course, just what compatibility meant and what was the extent of this Ruthene territory that was being allotted self-government, these were issues that remained to be defined. And so, following the close of World War I and the disappearance of Habsburg-ruled Austria-Hungary, historic Carpathian Rus found itself divided by international borders and under the rule of 3 states: Poland, where's the Lemko region, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, which got a small chunk of territory down here. There were also scattered and isolated Russian-inhabited villages and parts of Yugoslavia, that is the Vojvodina, and of what remained of Hungary. The fate of Carpatho-Rusyns was, from now on, to differ, and differ significantly, depending on which of these states they lived in: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, or Romania. And it is to that story that we will turn in our next 3 lectures beginning after our break that deal with the interwar years, from 1919 to 1939. What was the fate of Carpatho-Rusyns in each of these 3 countries?